The dust of forward operating base Kestrel clung to everything, a fine, gritty powder the color of rust and bone. It settled on the razor wire, coated the sand-colored HESCO barriers, and filmed the lens of Corporal Diaz's sunglasses as he watched the Osprey descend. The aircraft's rotors beat the hot, thin air into submission, kicking up a blinding storm. Inside the skeletal command tent, Colonel Marcus Thorne pinched the bridge of his nose, already nursing a headache. "She's here, sir," Sergeant Kovac said, his voice flat, devoid of the excitement that usually accompanied a visitor from high command. Thorne didn't look up from the digital map table. "I'm aware, Sergeant. Settle her in. Give her the standard tour. Don't let her wander off." The implication was clear. Babysit the civilian. When the rotors spun down, a single figure emerged, walking down the ramp with a slow, deliberate gait that seemed out of place amidst the coiled energy of the FOB. It was a woman, older than anyone's mother on this deployment. Her hair, a mix of silver and pale gold, was pulled back in a severe bun. She wore practical khaki trousers and a worn, slate-gray jacket over a simple shirt. She carried no tactical gear, only a single scuffed leather satchel that looked like it had been through a half-dozen wars already. Diaz nudged Private Miller, a kid barely out of his teens whose face was still soft with civilian life. "Get a load of that. Command sends us a librarian to win the war." Miller chuckled nervously. "What's she even doing here?" "Bureaucratic oversight," Diaz sneered, his voice low but carrying. "Some pencil pusher in a climate-controlled office decided we needed a human terrain analyst, probably here to write a report about our feelings." The woman, Anna, stopped at the edge of the landing pad, her pale blue eyes scanning the perimeter. They weren't the unfocused eyes of a tourist. They moved with a steady, methodical rhythm, taking in the machine gun emplacements, the interlocking fields of fire, the blind spots near the southern ridgeline. She saw everything, but her face remained a placid mask. Sergeant Kovac met her, his posture ramrod straight. "Ma'am, Sergeant Kovac. Welcome to FOB Kestrel." "Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, with a faint, unplaceable accent. It was a voice that didn't waste words. She offered no handshake. "Colonel Thorne is expecting you in the TOC," he said, gesturing toward the main tent. As they walked, the whispers followed them. The soldiers of 1st Platoon, hardened by 6 months in this desolate mountain range, saw a relic. They saw soft hands, a weathered face, and a body that looked too frail for the 7,000-foot altitude. They saw a liability. Her bag, in particular, drew their scorn. It was an old doctor-style satchel, the kind with brass clasps. It looked heavy. "Probably full of books," Diaz muttered to his fire team. "Or knitting." Inside the Tactical Operations Center, the air was cool and smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Colonel Thorne stood with his arms crossed, a man who believed precision and aggression were the only tools worth having. He gave Anna a look that was less a greeting and more an assessment of a problem. "Ms. Volkov," he said, not bothering to use her first name. "Thorne, I'll be brief. This is an active combat zone. We are prosecuting a counterinsurgency campaign against a well-entrenched local militia. Your brief from command says you're here to observe and advise. Observe all you want. But my men are busy. Stay out of their way. Sergeant Kovac will be your liaison." He turned back to the map table, a clear dismissal. Anna said nothing. She simply watched him, her gaze lingering for a moment on the tactical overlay, her eyes tracing the patrol routes and suspected enemy locations. There was a flicker of something in her expression. Not disapproval, but a deep, analytical stillness, as if she were committing the entire battle space to memory. "Kovac," Thorne barked without turning around. "Show her the guest quarters. Then get your squad ready for the afternoon patrol. Route Gamma, a simple presence patrol. Take her with you. Let her get the local flavor." Kovac's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Route Gamma ran through a narrow valley known colloquially as the Blender. It was never simple. The colonel was either testing the old woman or trying to scare her off on day one. "Sir," Kovac said, his voice carefully neutral. That's an order, Sergeant. Outside, the sun was a hammer. Kovac led her to a small, isolated container that served as VIP housing. This is you, ma'am. Patrol leaves in 30. I can have someone bring you some gear. This will suffice, Anna said, placing her leather satchel on the cot with a solid thud. Ma'am, with respect, Route Gamma can be unpredictable. You'll need body armor, a helmet. I'm aware, she said, her tone offering no further explanation. She began to unpack, not clothes, but small, dense objects wrapped in oilcloth. Kovac, feeling dismissed himself, nodded curtly and left her to it. He found his squad gearing up by the mats. Diaz was holding court as usual. So the grandma is coming with us? Diaz laughed, cinching a strap on his vest. Perfect. Maybe she can bake the insurgents some cookies and they'll leave us alone. Shut your mouth, Diaz, Kovac snapped. She's a civilian consultant. Commands orders. We treat her with respect. Respect is earned, Sarnti. Diaz shot back, a smirk playing on his lips. What's she done to earn it? Walk off a plane. As if on cue, Anna approached the vehicles. She had donned the helmet and plate carrier Kovac had left for her. They looked absurdly large on her small frame, like a child playing dress-up. But she moved without complaint, her stride even, her expression unchanged. She still carried her leather satchel, now slung over her shoulder. The weight of it made the strap dig into her jacket. Diaz stepped in front of her, his smile wide and predatory. Whoa there, ma'am. That bag looks heavy. Let me get that for you. He reached for the strap. Anna's hand moved with a speed that was startling. It wasn't a slap or a block, but a simple, firm interception. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist. Her grip was like steel. Diaz's smile faltered, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He tried to pull his arm back, but it was held fast. I can manage, Corporal, she said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with something cold and unyielding. She released him as suddenly as she had grabbed him. Diaz rubbed his wrist, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. The other soldiers fell silent. Miller looked down at his boots, suddenly fascinated by the scuffs on the toes. All right, mount up, Kovac ordered, breaking the tense silence. Volkov, you're in my vehicle. As Anna climbed into the MATV, settling into a rear seat, Diaz shot a dark look at his friends. The prank had failed, but his contempt had only hardened. The old woman had a strong grip. So what? She was still a liability, a piece of baggage they were being forced to haul into the blender. He swung into the gunner's turret of the lead vehicle, his anger simmering under the relentless sun. The patrol rolled out of the gate, kicking up a plume of that fine, endless dust, leaving the perceived safety of the FOB behind. The convoy rumbled through the valley, the high, jagged walls of rock pressing in on either side. The air in the MATV was thick with the smell of diesel and nervous sweat. Private Miller kept glancing at Anna. She sat perfectly still, her eyes scanning the ridgelines above them. She wasn't looking at the scenery. She was dissecting it. Her gaze would pause on a cluster of rocks, an overhang, a patch of scree. All the places a man with a rifle might hide. She was reading the terrain like a language she knew intimately. Diaz's voice crackled over the internal comms from the lead vehicle. Anything on your scope, Sarnti? All I've got is rocks and heat shimmer. Perfect day for a picnic. Just keep your eyes open, Diaz, Kovac replied, his own gaze fixed on the road ahead. He didn't like this. The valley was too quiet. The usual signs of life, a goat herder, a passing truck, even birds were absent. It was the kind of silence that preceded an explosion. Anna leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and low, meant only for Kovac. The rocks 200 meters up on the right. There's a washout that provides a natural defilade. It's a perfect L-shaped ambush point. Kovac glanced at the spot. It looked like every other pile of shattered rock in the godforsaken country. What makes you say that? The shadows are wrong, she said simply. And there is no dust signature on the lower scree slope. Something disturbed it recently, but not from below. From above. Before Kovac could process her observation, the world erupted. The first RPG slammed into the engine block of Diaz's MATV. The explosion was a deafening concussion of force and sound, flipping the multi-ton vehicle onto its side like a child's toy. Immediately, the air was torn apart by the rhythmic, hammering chatter of a heavy machine gun from the exact spot Anna had indicated. A storm of lead ripped through the air, punching through the thinner armor on the second vehicle, showering the interior with sparks and spalling. "Contact right! Contact right!" Kovac yelled into the radio, his training taking over. "Everyone out! Find cover!" The disciplined chaos of a firefight took hold. Doors were thrown open. Soldiers poured out, scrambling for the meager cover offered by the rocky roadside ditch. Bullets whizzed past their heads with angry snaps, kicking up puffs of dirt all around them. Inside Kovac's vehicle, Miller screamed. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his thigh, and blood was already soaking through his uniform, pooling on the floor plate. He was fumbling with his tourniquet, his hands shaking too badly to work the clasp. Panic began to set in. The enemy fire was overwhelming, accurate, and coming from a well-fortified, elevated position. They were caught in a perfectly executed kill zone. Diaz, having crawled from the smoking wreck of his MATV, was laying down wild, unaimed bursts from his rifle, his earlier bravado completely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a man who knew he was about to die. "They've got us pinned," someone shouted. "We can't move." Through it all, Anna was a portrait of impossible calm. As the soldiers scrambled out, she didn't run. She moved to Miller. "Give me that," she said, her voice cutting through his panicked cries. She took the tourniquet from his trembling hands. Her movements were economical, precise, and brutally efficient. She cinched the band high on his leg, twisting the windlass with a practiced strength that stopped the arterial bleeding in seconds. She pulled a pressure dressing from her satchel, not a standard-issue one, but a more advanced model packed with a hemostatic agent. "Look at me, Private," she commanded. Miller's terrified eyes locked onto hers. "Breathe. You're not going to die today." She worked quickly, packing the wound, securing the dressing, her hands steady despite the bullets impacting the vehicle just inches from her head. She had completely ignored the active threat, her focus absolute. Kovac, firing from behind the wheel of the disabled truck, watched her for a split second, stunned. She wasn't a liability. She was the calmest person in the entire firefight. Once Miller was stabilized, Anna grabbed her satchel and slid out of the vehicle, moving low to the ground. She didn't crawl frantically. She moved with a predator's grace, using the terrain to her advantage. She reached Kovac's position, the heavy machine gun fire still chewing up the ground around them. "Sergeant," she said, her voice barely audible above the din of battle. "Report." Kovac was so taken aback by her tone, not of a frightened civilian, but of a commanding officer, that he answered on instinct. "We're pinned. At least one HMG, maybe two. Multiple riflemen. They have the high ground. Comms are jammed. We're cut off." Anna nodded, her eyes already scanning the enemy position. "The HMG is the linchpin. It's behind that dark outcrop. They're using tracer rounds every 10th shot. They feel secure." Arrogant, she paused, her eyes narrowing. "There's a sniper, too, high to the left. He's picking his shots, waiting for someone to break cover." She pointed to a small puff of dust that Kovac hadn't even noticed. "See? He just ranged us." She was seeing the entire battle, not as a chaotic mess of violence, but as a tactical problem with a solution. While his soldiers were reacting, she was analyzing. "Diaz!" Kovac yelled. "Suppress that HMG." Diaz, huddled behind a rock, squeezed the trigger, sending a long, panicked burst in the general direction of the enemy. It was a waste of ammunition. Anna looked at the terrified corporal with something like pity. She turned back to Kovac. "That won't work. We need precision. We need to flank them." "Flank them? Ma'am, we can't even lift our heads." "There," she said, pointing to a narrow, vertical fissure in the rock face on their side of the valley, 100 yards back. It's a goat trail. It will lead up and behind their position. It's a steep climb, but it will put us above them. Kovac stared at the fissure. It was barely visible, a dark line against the sun-bleached rock. It was a suicidal climb under normal circumstances, let alone under fire. We'll be exposed the whole way. No, Anna corrected him. Their sniper is focused on this position. The machine gunner has a narrow field of fire. They won't see a two-man team moving along the valley wall until it's too late. But we need a diversion. She looked down at one of the soldiers, a young private who was frozen in fear, his rifle clutched to his chest. Soldier, what is your name? Harris, ma'am, he stammered. Harris, I need you and Diaz to lay down suppressive fire on the HMG nest. Not long bursts, short, controlled. 3-round bursts. Count to 5. Fire again. Make them keep their heads down. Can you do that? Her calm, authoritative voice seemed to reach him through the fear. He nodded numbly. Yes, ma'am. Anna then looked at Kovac. Sergeant, I need your rifle. Kovac hesitated for only a second before unclipping his M4, fitted with an advanced scope. He trusted her more than he trusted his own panicked men right now. He handed it to her. Her hands closed around the weapon, and any trace of the frail, older woman vanished completely. It was like watching a master craftsman pick up a familiar tool. She checked the magazine, chambered around, and adjusted the stock against her shoulder in one fluid motion. The rifle looked like an extension of her body. Cover me, she said. Kovac nodded, taking Harris's rifle. Diaz. Harris. On my mark. Suppress that nest. Mark. The two soldiers began firing, their shots more disciplined now, guided by a clear purpose. The volume of incoming fire lessened slightly as the enemy gunner was forced to duck. In that tiny window, Anna moved. She didn't run. She flowed across the open ground to the base of the fissure, a gray shadow against the brown earth. She was faster than any woman her age had a right to be. She reached the crack in the rock and began to climb, her worn boots finding purchase where Kovac could see none. She moved with the silent, deadly competence of a mountain cat. Kovac watched, his heart pounding. He continued to direct the suppressive fire, his mind reeling. Who was this woman? A human terrain analyst? No analyst moved like that. No bureaucrat handled a weapon with that kind of lethal familiarity. Anna climbed, the heavy satchel still slung over her back. She used the rock for cover, moving from one piece of concealment to the next. The enemy never saw her. Within minutes, she had vanished from sight, swallowed by the mountain. The firefight raged on below. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The suppressive fire was working, but their ammunition was running low. The enemy, sensing a lull, began to push their advantage. The HMG opened up again, its fire more confident, chewing up the last of their cover. Sarenti, we're out of options, Diaz yelled, his voice cracking. We're done for. And then, from high above them, came the sharp, distinct crack of a single rifle shot. It was nothing like the chaotic chatter of the battle below. It was a cold, precise, surgical sound. The enemy heavy machine gun fell silent. A moment later, another single shot. Kovac, peering through his binoculars, saw one of the riflemen on the ridge clutch his chest and fall backward. The third shot, the sniper, who had been repositioning, tumbled from his perch high on the cliff face. Silence. The sudden absence of noise was more shocking than the firefight itself. The remaining insurgents, their command and support elements eliminated in 3 perfect shots, broke. Kovac could hear them shouting in confusion and fear. A few moments later, they were dragging their wounded and melting back into the mountains, leaving their dead behind. The battle was over. It had ended as quickly as it had begun. Kovac's squad slowly, cautiously, got to their feet. They looked at each other, then up at the ridge where the shots had come from. They were breathing heavily, their faces slick with sweat and grime. They were alive and they had no idea why. A few minutes later, Anna reappeared, climbing down the same fissure with the same unhurried grace. She walked back to their position, the rifle held casually in one hand. There was no triumph on her face, no adrenaline flush. She looked as calm as she had when she'd stepped off the Osprey. She handed the rifle back to Kovac. "The primary threat is neutralized," she said, as if giving a weather report. "But there will be others. We should move before they regroup." Kovac took the weapon, his hands shaking slightly. He looked from her placid face to the silent enemy position. 3 shots, 3 key targets. It wasn't just good shooting. It was a masterclass in combat triage, identifying and eliminating the most critical threats within human efficiency. As she knelt to check on Miller again, her satchel swung forward. The main clasp, damaged by a piece of shrapnel, gave way, and the bag fell open. A few items spilled onto the dusty ground. There were no books. There was no knitting. There were high-grade medical supplies, a compact satellite phone, a set of specialized breaching tools, and a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. As it rolled, the cloth came loose, revealing a block of C4 plastic explosive. But that wasn't what caught Kovac's eye. A small, tarnished metal tag had also fallen out. It was an old, rectangular piece of brass, stamped with 4 faded stars and a name. Volkov A. Kovac stared at it, his mind refusing to connect the dots. For stars. He looked up at the quiet, unassuming woman tending to his wounded soldier. The pieces began to click into place with the force of a physical blow. The way she analyzed the terrain, the instant tactical assessment, the impossible calm under fire, the lethal precision with a rifle she'd never held before. Just then, the comms unit, free from the jamming, crackled to life. It was Colonel Thorne's voice, sharp with anxiety. "Kestrel 6. This is Kestrel Actual, Sitrep. Over. I show you static in the blender. Report." Kovac fumbled for his handset, his throat suddenly dry. He keyed the mic. "Actual, this is 6. We were ambushed. Heavy contact. The threat has been neutralized. We are secure." Neutralized. Thorne's voice was incredulous. "By who? Your squad was pinned down and outgunned. Who took command?" "Sergeant." Kovac looked at Anna, who was now calmly showing Miller how to apply pressure to his own wound. He saw the 4-star tag lying in the dirt. He saw the quiet, unassuming power that had just saved all their lives. He made a decision. He wasn't just a sergeant anymore, he was a witness. He took a deep breath. "Colonel, we had help." Before Thorne could reply, a new voice cut across the command channel, overriding all other traffic. It was a high-priority signal coming from Bagram or even further up the chain. The voice was frantic, laced with authority and panic. "All stations on this net, this is Olympus. We have a priority signal for Kestrel Actual. We have lost contact with a VIP in your AO. Colonel Thorne, confirm status of Observer Volkov. I repeat, is General Volkov with you? Is Wraith on site?" The call sign hung in the air, an impossible, legendary name from the blackest, most brutal operations of a previous generation. A ghost. A myth whispered about by old intelligence officers and grizzled special forces veterans. Wraith was not a person. It was a phenomenon, a name attached to missions that officially never happened, to victories snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. The soldiers of 1st Platoon froze. Diaz, who had been staring at the ground in shame, slowly lifted his head, his face a mask of disbelief. Miller, lying on the ground, stared at the woman who had just saved his life, his mouth hanging open. They all looked at her. Kovac let the colonel's channel go. He switched to his squad's internal comms, his voice low but filled with a new, profound authority that none of them had ever heard from him before. "Everyone, on your feet. Secure the perimeter. Show some goddamn respect." He then walked over to Anna, who was looking up at him, her expression unreadable. He ignored the squawking radio. He ignored the stunned faces of his men. He stood before her, clicked his heels together in the dusty road, and rendered the sharpest salute of his entire career. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion and a dawning, terrifying reverence. He spoke loud enough for his handset to pick it up, loud enough for the colonel listening miles away to hear every single word. "General, your orders." The return to FOB Kestrel was silent. The usual post-patrol banter was replaced by a heavy, contemplative quiet. The men of 1st Platoon didn't look at each other. They looked at Anna. They watched the way she sat, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes once again scanning the terrain as if nothing had happened. They saw her now not as a frail old woman, but as something else entirely. They replayed the events of the ambush in their minds, and every detail took on a new, chilling significance. Her initial assessment of the ambush site, her calm triage of Miller's wound, the impossible speed of her hands on Diaz's wrist, the 3 perfect shots. Diaz sat in the back of the MATV, his rifle across his lap, his face pale. He remembered his sneering comments, his offer to carry her bag, the casual, arrogant cruelty. The memory burned in his gut like acid. He had tried to steal from the bag of a living legend. He had mocked a ghost. The shame was so profound it felt like a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. He felt small, insignificant, a child who had tried to pick a fight with the force of nature. When the convoy rolled back through the gates of the FOB, the entire atmosphere of the place seemed different. Word had spread like wildfire over the comms. Soldiers stopped what they were doing, emerging from tents and workshops, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. They watched as the dusty maps came to a stop. Colonel Marcus Thorne was waiting for them at the debriefing area. He was not standing with his arms crossed in his usual posture of impatient authority. He stood alone, his hands clasped behind his back, his face grim. He had heard Kovac's transmission. He had heard the priority call from Olympus. He had spent the last hour on a secure channel with a 3-star general at CENTCOM who had, in no uncertain terms, explained the magnitude of his catastrophic failure in judgment. The ramp of the MATV lowered. Kovac stepped out first, followed by the rest of the squad. They moved with a new formality, forming a loose, protective semicircle. Then Anna descended. She still wore the ill-fitting body armor, but it no longer looked absurd. It looked like a disguise she had deigned to wear for their benefit. Thorne walked forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't address Kovac or anyone else. His eyes were fixed on Anna. He marched directly to her, his movements stiff and formal. He stopped precisely 3 paces in front of her. For a moment, he just stood there, the full weight of his arrogance crumbling under the gaze of her calm, pale eyes. He saw the dust on her jacket, the smudge of grime on her cheek, the utter lack of fear or ego in her expression. He saw the woman his superiors had called the final option. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so precise, it was a physical apology. It was the salute of a subordinate to a superior officer of a rank he could barely comprehend. "General Volkov," he said, his voice strained, stripped of all its earlier condescension. I apologize for my reception, for my ignorance. This FOB, my command. It is yours, ma'am. I await your orders." The assembled soldiers watched in stunned silence. A full-bird colonel, the undisputed king of this remote castle, was humbling himself completely. Anna looked at him, her expression unchanging. She held his gaze for a long moment, letting the weight of his apology settle in the hot, dusty air. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of his surrender. She unstrapped the borrowed helmet, her movements fluid, and handed it to a wide-eyed Private Miller. She then walked past Colonel Thorne without another word, heading toward her small container, her old leather satchel held firmly in her hand. The crowd of soldiers parted for her like water, their eyes following her with a mixture of awe, fear, and a deep, abiding respect. Later that night, the FOB was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a place that had been touched by something profound. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones. The story of the ambush in the blender was already becoming legend, embellished with every telling. 3 shots. The call sign wraith. The colonel's salute. Inside her Spartan container, Annalise Volkov sat on the edge of her cot. The single bulb overhead cast long shadows. Her satchel lay open before her. She was not cleaning a weapon or studying a map. Her hands, which had been so steady and lethal only hours before, were now moving with a gentle reverence. She took out the block of C4 and the breaching tools, setting them aside with the detached air of a carpenter putting away her tools. She repacked the medical supplies, her fingers tracing the edges of the advanced clotting agents and sterile suture kits. Finally, at the very bottom of the bag, she reached for a small velvet pouch. From it, she carefully removed a set of old, faded dog tags. They were worn smooth from years of handling. The names on them were not her own. She held them in the palm of her hand, her thumb stroking the raised letters. Her face, for the first time since she had arrived, softened. The mask of impassive competence fell away, revealing a flicker of ancient grief, a sorrow so deep it seemed carved into the lines around her eyes. The door to her container creaked open. Sergeant Kovac stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim lights of the FOB. He held 2 steaming ceramic mugs. He didn't speak, didn't ask for permission to enter. He understood that words were inadequate now. He walked in and placed one of the mugs on the small table beside her cot. It was coffee, black and strong. He pulled up the container's only chair and sat down, holding his own mug. He didn't look at the dog tags in her hand. He gave her the privacy of her ritual. Anna carefully placed the tags back in the velvet pouch and returned them to the bottom of her satchel. She closed the brass clasps with a soft, final click. Then she picked up the coffee mug, her hands wrapping around its warmth. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the distant hum of a generator and the lonely cry of a night bird in the mountains. Outside, the first hint of dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky, turning the black, jagged peaks into soft, gray silhouettes. Kovac finally broke the silence, his voice low and raspy. "The men, they understand. They'll follow you to hell and back, ma'am." Anna took a slow sip of her coffee. She looked out the small window at the emerging light. "That's not why I'm here, Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm not here to lead. I'm here to make sure men like you and your soldiers get to go home." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of battles, of losses, of hard-won wisdom. She was not a warrior who reveled in combat. She was a guardian who endured it. The call sign wraith wasn't about being a ghost who brought death. It was about being a presence that prevented it, a final measure when all else had failed. Kovac nodded slowly, understanding completely. He had seen both sides of her today, the lethal strategist who could dismantle an enemy force in seconds, and the quiet woman who mourned with a pair of old dog tags. He was beginning to see the true nature of her strength. It wasn't just tactical genius or skill with a rifle. It was a profound, unyielding sense of duty, forged in crucibles he could barely imagine. They finished their coffee as the sun crested the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light. The new day washed over the FOB, burning away the shadows of the night. It was a promise of survival, a promise that Annalise Volkov had personally delivered. She stood up, her small frame seeming to possess an impossible gravity. "Thank you for the coffee, Sergeant," she said. "Any time, General," he replied, rising to his feet. The title felt natural on his tongue now. Felt right. She picked up her satchel, the scuffed leather seeming less like a civilian accessory and more like a container of immense power and history. She was ready for the day. Her war was far from over. It had simply followed her here, to this forgotten corner of the world, where a new generation of soldiers was learning what it truly meant to earn respect.